We're here with Dr. Kate Creevy and Dr. Daniel Promislow. Dr. Creevy is an internist at the University of Georgia, and Dr. Promislow is a geneticist. In 2011, the two of you published a paper in the Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine that literally went viral. Can you talk to us about it? What was it about?
The paper described general causes of death in about 80 different breeds of dogs. And we were interested in finding out what different breeds die of. The whole project was inspired really by a photo on the cover of Science showing a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, and this paper looked at the genetics of size differences. I'm interested in the genetics of aging, and I thought, wow, we could look at why it is that small dogs live so much longer than big dogs and what they die of. And I realized the only problem was I didn't know the first thing about dogs, and so I turned to Katie.
How did the two of you meet and start to collaborate?
It was actually very fortuitous. Daniel quite literally called the teaching hospital and spoke to Dr. Doug Allen, the hospital director at the time, and said he was looking for a collaborator to help him with the data set he had obtained of abstracted medical records describing causes of death in dogs at all the veterinary teaching hospitals in the country. And I was a relatively new hire at the time. I had been on the faculty for 6 weeks, 2 months, and one of the people who was available to collaborate in things didn't have any ongoing projects, and Doug called me up and said, hey, talk to this guy in genetics. And it was fantastic. I mean, it was really, it turned into what I always say is a true collaboration. Daniel jokes that he doesn't know anything about dogs. I don't know very much about genetics. And so we really have each something to bring to the collaboration.
So did the paper discover anything new?
Well, it's interesting. The objective of the paper was to describe actual causes of death in actual pet dogs who were cared for by their owners in veterinary teaching hospitals to the modern extent of veterinary science. And so it confirmed a lot of things that we all thought we knew. As practitioners, as clinicians, we tend to have impressions that certain breeds of dogs die of X disease or Y disease. But the best part of this paper was that the size of the study enabled us to learn about breeds of dogs that are rare enough that we didn't previously have an opinion about them one way or the other.
So give me an example.
So for example, golden retrievers, everybody knows, they're a very common breed. We know that they tend to get a lot of cancer, and we confirmed that yes, in fact, golden retrievers died of cancer more than any other causes. But Norwegian elk hounds died of urogenital diseases. Well, I've probably handled a dozen Norwegian elk hounds in my career. I don't have enough experience with that relatively rare breed to have an opinion one way or the other of the sorts of diseases that they die from. And so now we had enough dogs in the data set to statistically analyze and discover that finding.
Well, and of course here at the University of Georgia, the bulldog is very near and dear to our hearts. Anything about bulldogs in the study?
So the bulldogs had a high risk of death due to respiratory diseases, which is not surprising given the nature of their head shape. We know this is true as clinicians, that they tend to have a lot of problems with breathing difficulties. And so again, our clinical impression of the breathing difficulties of the breed and the surgeries required to help the breed were confirmed by this very large study.
One thing you said that was interesting, Daniel, is the fact that the cover of Science really inspired you with the Chihuahua and the Great Dane. They're all the same species, right? So why do we have one dog that's that huge and one that's that little? How did that happen?
As a geneticist, I would say the first answer is that it all comes down to genetics. That paper was about the genetics of size, and in fact, size is a very complex trait that has lots of genetic influences and also environmental influences. The paper found that a single gene could account for a lot of all of that variation in size. How did they get to be so different? Well, that's just the process of artificial selection, that breeders, given enough time and given enough genetic variation, can create all kinds of different kinds of dogs. So the reason they look so different is genetics. If we were to find a Chihuahua and a Great Dane in the wild, no biologist would call them the same species, but they are in fact the same species, and all of the different breeds can interbreed. But it's just a couple of hundred years of breeders choosing particular traits that they wanted that's led to this enormous variation. And in fact, the wonderful thing is that it has created variation that people like Katie and I can then study and understand.
So how is this study helpful to veterinarians?
So as veterinarians, we're interested in maintaining health, and maintaining health and protecting health is always more efficient and less expensive than treating disease. So as clinicians, if we can better anticipate the sorts of things that are likely to go wrong within a given breed or size or age or gender class of dogs, we can tailor our preventive health care towards those expected outcomes. That's kind of broadly what we can do with the data at this point. Long term, it might be possible to hone in on some of these causes. I mentioned the Norwegian elk hound and the urogenital diseases. We can refine down within that category of causes of death to specific disease causes of death, and perhaps be able to discover genetic traits that could be bred out of the breed or could be tested for in the breed young in life.
So Daniel, how has the study been helpful to the general public?
I think there are two ways that it can help the general public. One is for dog owners who want to know what their dog might get sick from. They can talk to their vet, and the vet can look at our database and say, oh, you have this breed. It's a pretty unusual breed, but it tends to have these problems. And so the owner can watch out for those problems. And if a symptom arises, they can go right to the vet and say, I think it might have something to do with what you warned me about. So it can help the public in looking out for what their dogs might get sick of, especially for unusual breeds where it's not so well known. But in the longer term, there's also a pretty direct way that it might be able to help people, not just dog owners, but all people, and that is that dogs often get sick from the same things that humans get sick from. And not only do we have a lot of information about what all these different breeds die from, but we also have a lot of information about their genetics. And so ultimately, we might be able to identify genes that are associated with an increased risk of a particular disease in dogs. So if we identify a gene or a genetic pathway that increases the risk of a particular disease that also occurs in humans, we then have a kind of candidate for the gene that might affect that disease in humans. And if we can identify genes that affect particular diseases in humans, that can eventually help us to treat those diseases. So there are two very different but important ways in which our work, I think, can help the general public.
And again, getting back to that whole one medicine theory that we've been talking a lot about. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Katie. It was wonderful having you both here today.
Thank you. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure.